1932, Macon, Georgia, stood in the long shadow of the Great Depression, a city that tried to appear steady while its people quietly unraveled. Storefronts opened each morning with less certainty than the day before. Factories hummed at half strength or not at all. Men gathered at corners pretending to discuss weather while counting the coins in their pockets. Yet the Macon Public Library opened on time, every time, as if routine itself could hold the world together. Its red brick facade and tall columns suggested permanence, order, and the promise that knowledge could outlast hunger. Inside, the floors were polished, the shelves aligned, the rules clear. Outside, the rules were clearer still, especially for those whose names and faces were never meant to cross the threshold. On the lowest stone step, where the shadow of the building broke against the sidewalk, an 11-year-old black boy named Elijah Turner took his seat before the doors unlocked. He arrived early not because he expected entry, but because the quiet suited him. Morning light pooled at his feet, and he placed his book carefully on his knees, smoothing the page as if it might tear from impatience. The book was old, its spine cracked, its cover long gone. He had found it weeks earlier in a heap of discarded things behind a grocery store, paper mixed with spoiled produce and cardboard boxes. To anyone else it was trash. To Elijah, it was a doorway that didn't ask his name. Elijah read slowly. He had taught himself that way, sounding out words only in his head, letting sentences settle before moving on. Reading aloud felt dangerous outside, attention invited questions, and questions rarely came with kindness. He learned to read with his eyes, his lips barely moving, his face calm even when the meaning struck him hard. He read about places he would never see and ideas that felt both hopeful and forbidden. He read until the street grew busy, until footsteps passed close enough that he could feel the vibration through the stone step. Some people walked wide arcs around him, as if proximity alone might implicate them. Others glanced down and away, quick and practiced, like people stepping over something they did not wish to acknowledge. Elijah understood the rules without being taught. He did not try the door. He did not test the handle. He did not ask a question that would make someone answer him. The city had taught him early that some things were not meant to be tried. Instead, he let the door exist as a boundary he did not need to cross to learn. The glass panes reflected the street, sometimes catching his face layered over rows of books inside. He noticed this once and then stopped looking. Reflections could confuse a boy if he stared too long. His mother, Rose Turner, worked mornings washing clothes for a white family a few blocks away. She worried when Elijah sat near the library, not because he misbehaved, but because quiet children were often punished for reasons no one explained. She had told him, gently and more than once, to stay where people could see him clearly. "Don't give them a reason," she said. Elijah nodded each time, understanding that reasons were often invented. Still, the library steps felt safer than most places. No one chased him away. No one asked him to move. The building itself did not speak, and its silence felt almost like permission. As the doors opened, patrons flowed inside, men in worn suits, women clutching bags, students with notebooks tucked under arms. Elijah watched them go without envy, only curiosity. He wondered what it felt like to stand among shelves where every book was reachable, to choose without calculating who might be watching. He wondered how many answers waited just beyond the glass. Then he returned to his page. Wondering could wait, reading could not. Inside the library, a few people noticed him through the door. At first he was a detail, a shape that repeated day after day. Over time, repetition turned him into a presence. A boy who did nothing wrong yet refused to disappear unsettled the room. Librarians whispered to one another without deciding anything. Patrons mentioned him in passing, unsure why he stayed in their thoughts. Elijah felt none of this directly. He felt only the steady pull of words and the odd comfort of routine: arrive early, read carefully, leave when the light shifted. That morning, Elijah reached the end of a chapter and paused. The sentence he had just read spoke of laws and rights and a country learning to define itself. He did not yet have the language to name the contradiction pressing on his chest, but he felt it all the same. He closed the book for a moment, resting his hands on the cover, and listened to the city breathe. Somewhere inside, pages turned softly. Outside, a truck backfired and a man laughed too loudly. Elijah opened the book again. He did not know what he would become. He did not know that this step would one day be remembered. He only knew that if knowledge had a cost, he was already paying it, quietly, patiently, one page at a time. Days passed, and then weeks, and Elijah Turner remained. The city changed around him in small, almost unnoticeable ways. A shop closed. Another reopened under a different name. Men stopped gathering at the same corner. The library, however, stayed constant, and so did the boy on its steps. Elijah's routine became as predictable as the opening bell. He arrived before the doors unlocked, sat on the same stone step, and opened his book to wherever he had last stopped. He did not rush. He never rushed. Words, he believed, revealed themselves only to those who waited. Elijah had learned patience early. His father had died when he was 7, not in some dramatic moment, but quietly, worn down by labor and illness. There had been no speeches, no final lessons, just absence. His mother worked longer hours after that, coming home with hands that smelled of soap and skin rubbed raw. She asked about school, about food, about safety. She did not ask about dreams. Dreams were dangerous when you could not afford disappointment. Elijah sensed this and kept his thoughts to himself, letting books carry the weight he could not share. The books he found were never chosen, they were encountered. Some were missing pages. Others ended abruptly, as if the story itself had been interrupted. He read them anyway. He read about explorers who mapped lands already occupied, about presidents whose faces appeared on coins he rarely touched, about laws written in language so careful it felt fragile. The words did not always welcome him, but they did not push him away either. In that neutrality, Elijah found freedom. Inside the library, the atmosphere shifted subtly. People began to sit near the windows, pretending coincidence. Some glanced down at Elijah with expressions they could not quite explain, part guilt, part curiosity, part annoyance. A child reading outside a place built for reading created an imbalance that no rule addressed. He was not begging. He was not loud. He was simply there, absorbing something meant to be controlled. One librarian, Mrs. Caldwell, noticed him more than the others. She had worked there for 15 years and prided herself on order. She believed in systems, in knowing where things belonged. Elijah disrupted that belief. Each morning she watched him through the glass, waiting for him to move on, to be distracted, to prove that her discomfort was temporary. He never did. His persistence felt personal, though he had never spoken to her. It troubled her that the rules she enforced did not offer guidance on what to do with a quiet child who refused to misbehave. Elijah, meanwhile, noticed changes of his own. Some patrons began leaving books outside the door, intentionally or not, he could not tell. A paperback placed carefully on the ledge. A folded newspaper left behind. Once, a history book appeared beside him without explanation. He did not look up. He did not thank anyone. He understood instinctively that gratitude could invite conversation, and conversation could invite trouble. Instead, he read what was given and returned to his routine. On certain afternoons, Elijah read until the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the street. He liked that hour best. The city quieted, and the library grew calm again. He could almost imagine himself inside, seated at a long table, his book open without fear. Sometimes he imagined speaking aloud, testing ideas in the air. He wondered what his voice sounded like when it carried confidence. The thought embarrassed him, and he buried it beneath the page. One afternoon, as autumn approached, Elijah encountered a passage that stopped him cold. It spoke of equality, not as a promise, but as an assumption. The author wrote as if the idea were already settled, already lived. Elijah reread the paragraph 3 times, then once more. His chest tightened. He did not yet know the word contradiction, but he felt it. He looked up at the library doors, then back to the book. Something in him shifted, not into anger, but into clarity. If the words could exist, even imperfectly, then so could he. That day, someone exiting the library slowed. The man was tall, his posture slightly stooped from years of leaning over desks. His coat was worn but clean, his face marked by thought rather than hardship. He had noticed Elijah before, as others had, but this time he stopped. He watched the boy read without interruption, taking in the careful way Elijah traced lines with his finger, the concentration that blocked out the world. It was not the presence of a child that held his attention, it was the seriousness. The man waited until Elijah reached the end of the page. "What are you reading?" he asked, not unkindly. Elijah hesitated. Adults rarely asked questions without expectation. Still, something in the man's tone felt different, curious, not demanding. "American history," Elijah said quietly. The man raised an eyebrow. He knew the book. He knew its difficulty. He also knew who was not meant to read it. "That's not an easy book," he said. Elijah met his eyes for the first time. "I know," he replied. The simplicity of the answer unsettled the man. He nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a fact he had not previously considered. Without another word, he walked away, carrying the image with him, an image that would not loosen its grip. Elijah returned to his book, unaware that his quiet presence had begun to echo beyond the steps. He did not know that he had entered someone else's thoughts, that questions were forming where certainty once lived. He knew only that the page before him demanded attention, and he was willing to give it. The city continued to move. The library continued to open. And Elijah continued to read, each day, unknowingly pressing against the boundaries of what the city believed possible. The professor's name was Thomas Avery, though Elijah would not learn it for some time. He taught history at a small college on the edge of town, a place that prided itself on tradition more than progress. Avery had spent years lecturing about constitutions, amendments, and ideals he believed in more than he practiced. He was not a radical. He was not a rebel. He was, by his own assessment, a reasonable man who believed change happened slowly and safely, preferably without asking him to choose sides. Yet that afternoon, the image of a boy reading on a stone step refused to leave him. Avery returned to the library the next day, and the day after that, timing his visits to coincide with the boy's presence. He told himself he was merely curious, that he was observing a social phenomenon, nothing more. But observation has a way of turning into responsibility when repeated often enough. He noticed how Elijah held his book, how he shielded the page from wind with his body, how he never once glanced inside with longing or resentment. The boy did not perform suffering. He simply endured it. Inside the library, Avery mentioned the boy in passing to a colleague. The response was uncomfortable silence. Another day, he asked Mrs. Caldwell whether anyone had spoken to the child. She stiffened, adjusting a stack of returns as if alignment could substitute for an answer. "He doesn't belong inside," she said finally, more to herself than to him. Avery nodded, but the word struck him as incomplete. Belonging, he thought, was not always granted. Sometimes it was claimed. Elijah sensed the attention before he understood it. Adults lingered nearby more often now. Conversation stopped when he looked up. A woman once placed a book beside him deliberately and walked away too quickly to pretend otherwise. He read it carefully, returned it to the step when he finished, and never mentioned it. Attention, he had learned, was a resource to be managed. Too much could be dangerous. Too little could erase you. At home, Elijah's mother noticed changes as well. He spoke more at dinner, asked questions about words he had encountered. He wanted to know why some rules felt invisible until they were broken. Rose listened, choosing her answers carefully. She did not lie, but she did not tell the whole truth either. Survival had taught her the value of partial explanations. One evening, she asked where he found the new books. Elijah shrugged. "They show up," he said. Rose looked at him for a long moment. She wanted to tell him to stop. She wanted to pull him away from anything that drew attention. But she also saw something else, a steadiness she had not known how to give him. She said nothing. The turning point came quietly, as such moments often do. One morning, rain fell hard and sudden, turning the street slick and gray. Elijah arrived anyway, his book tucked beneath his shirt to keep it dry. He sat, hunched against the weather, reading with the same concentration he always did. Inside the library, patrons gathered near the windows, watching the storm. Someone remarked that no child should sit outside in weather like that. Another replied that rules were rules. Thomas Avery stood among them, listening. Without announcing himself, he walked to the front desk and asked for a library card. "For whom?" Mrs. Caldwell asked. "For the boy outside," Avery said. The words landed heavily. Mrs. Caldwell looked toward the door, then back at Avery. "That's not possible," she said. Avery waited. Silence filled the space between them. "Why not?" he asked. The question was not aggressive. It was precise. It demanded an answer that could not hide behind habit. Mrs. Caldwell did not respond immediately. She had enforced rules for so long that their origins had blurred into inevitability. She knew only that the library had never issued a card to a child like Elijah. That knowledge had always been enough. "It's policy," she said finally. Avery nodded again. "Policies are written by people," he said. "And people revise them." The conversation ended without resolution, but it did not end the matter. That afternoon, a small meeting was held in the back room, quiet, informal, undocumented. The boy's name was mentioned. So was the college. So was the possibility of attention no one wanted. Outside, Elijah finished his chapter and closed the book as the rain slowed. He stood, stretched his stiff legs, and prepared to leave. Before he could take a step, the library door opened. Mrs. Caldwell stood there. She did not smile. She did not frown. She held a piece of paper in her hand. "Come inside," she said. Elijah froze. Years of unspoken instruction held him in place. He looked at the door, then at her face, searching for warning. He saw none. "I can't," he said quietly. Mrs. Caldwell's voice softened, though she did not know why. "Just for today," she said. Elijah took one step forward. Then another. Crossing the threshold felt unreal, like stepping into a place he had visited only in dreams. The air inside was cooler, still. Every sound seemed amplified. Conversation stopped. He followed Mrs. Caldwell to the desk, his heart pounding louder than his footsteps. She slid the paper toward him. It was a temporary pass. No name printed. No photograph. Just permission. Elijah did not touch it at first. Thomas Avery watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. He knew this was not a victory. It was a beginning, and beginnings were fragile. Elijah finally reached for the paper. His hands trembled. "Where should I sit?" he asked. Mrs. Caldwell gestured toward a table near the window. Elijah walked slowly, acutely aware of every eye on him. He sat, placed his book on the table, and opened it to the page he had marked that morning. He read. Nothing dramatic happened. No applause. No announcement. The library returned to its rhythm. But something irreversible had occurred. The door had opened, not because it was forced, but because it had been questioned. And Elijah Turner read on, unaware that the city would never quite return to what it had been before. Elijah Turner did not speak about the day he first entered the library. He did not tell his mother in detail, and he did not mention it to anyone at school. He sensed, without fully understanding why, that some moments lost their power when spoken too loudly. Instead, he returned the next morning as he always had, early, quiet, prepared. This time, however, he walked through the doors without hesitation. No one stopped him. No one welcomed him either. The absence of reaction felt like a compromise, and Elijah accepted it gratefully. Weeks passed, then months. The temporary pass became permanent, though no one ever formally acknowledged the change. Elijah was issued a library card one afternoon without ceremony. His name was written carefully, the ink slightly smudged. He stared at it longer than necessary, committing the shape of the letters to memory. It was the first time he had seen his name connected to a place that did not feel borrowed. Inside the library, Elijah learned new kinds of discipline. He learned how to choose books rather than accept what appeared. He learned how to sit still for hours without losing focus, how to take notes in the margins of scrap paper, how to follow ideas from one shelf to another. Librarians corrected him when he broke small rules, books returned late, chairs not pushed in, but they corrected him as they would any other patron. That sameness mattered more than kindness. Outside the library, the city changed more slowly. Some people noticed Elijah's new routine and disapproved quietly. Others pretended not to see him at all. There were no protests, no editorials, no sudden moral awakenings. Progress arrived the way it often does, incrementally, without permission, carried by individuals who did not ask to represent anything larger than themselves. Thomas Avery watched from a distance. He never claimed responsibility for what had happened, even in private. He understood that claiming it would reduce it, turning a human shift into a personal victory. Instead, he wrote letters. He revised lectures. He asked harder questions. In classrooms that had grown comfortable with easy answers. Occasionally, he nodded to Elijah when they crossed paths, nothing more. Elijah grew older. By the time he was 16, his reading had outpaced his schooling. He read philosophy and law, economics and history, not because he planned a future around them, but because understanding felt necessary. He noticed patterns, how language shaped power, how silence preserved it. He began to recognize the forces that had once seemed abstract. The library had not saved him. It had sharpened him. His mother aged faster than he did. Years of labor bent her posture, dulled her hands. She watched her son study by lamplight each night and worried, not because she doubted him, but because the world rarely rewarded boys like him for being prepared. Still, she said nothing. Pride, she believed, should be carried quietly. Elijah left Macon on a scholarship few people expected him to receive. He traveled with one suitcase and a stack of notebooks. At the college he attended, he was often the only black student in the room. He endured stares, assumptions, and the familiar pressure to represent more than himself. But he had learned something early on: isolation did not equal emptiness. He filled it with work. Years passed again. Elijah became a lawyer, not a famous one, not immediately. He worked cases others avoided. He argued carefully, methodically, with an attention to language that unsettled opponents. He believed laws mattered because they were written, and because they could be rewritten. When he spoke, people listened, not because of his voice, but because of his precision. He never wasted words. He returned to Macon once, years later, for a conference. The city looked smaller. The library stood unchanged, its steps worn smoother by time. Inside, a modest plaque listed notable figures associated with the institution. His name appeared among them, without explanation. Elijah stood before it briefly. He did not feel triumph. He felt distance. The boy on the steps and the man in the suit were not separate people, but they were not the same either. What connected them was not struggle alone, but choice, the decision to remain, to read, to wait without surrender. Elijah left the library without ceremony. Outside, the stone step was empty. History did not record the arguments held in back rooms or the quiet discomfort that preceded change. It rarely does. What it recorded instead was outcome, a name, a career, a line in a book. The rest remained scattered across memory, like pages left behind. This is not a story about a door opening. It is a story about a child who learned that knowledge does not require permission, only persistence. About a city that changed not because it wanted to, but because it could no longer ignore what stood patiently at its threshold. And about the quiet truth that some revolutions do not announce themselves. They sit. They read. And they wait.